Welcome to the Monday Morning Mixtapes History of Metal. This week's episode we're going to be exploring the 90s. A very turbulent time and very, very creative time for heavy metal. Stay tuned. So we're after kind of trouncing our way through the 70s and the 80s, and then we get to, I suppose, my favourite period, probably because that's when I was a teenager, is the 90s with it. And of course, you would have been a teenager too then as well.
Was I or wasn't I?
I don't know, who knows? We'll have to...
I'm ageless.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But it's... Yeah, I suppose we kind of rounded off last week, the last episode, with the whole thing about, like, with the 80s with hair metal, and it was just coming up to that point when it was dying. So I suppose going into the 90s, that was where kind of like metal, I think as we'll kind of see, and it keeps repeating itself, we have these things, they start off as an underground thing, then they kind of become very bloated. There's loads of imitators jump in on the bandwagon, and it just kills off the scene completely, or maybe not kills it off completely, but kind of buries it for a while, and then 10 years later re-emerges. There seems to be this cycle that goes on with metal. But I think the 90s was the time when metal really, really expanded and branched out into like fucking
millions
genres.
of subgenres, yeah. Like
we briefly touched on in our 80s episode, but I suppose in the 80s, people who look back on it, in mid-80s, late 80s, it was kind of like the birth of a lot of extreme metal. Thrash was after coming into its own, and I suppose people who were into thrash mightn't agree with this, but I think the large part from my point of view, thrash music kind of came from a thing where it had the aggressiveness of punk mixed with metal, but with like more virtuosic, kind of like, you know, plain. Virtuosic? Is that even a word? Virtuosity. So like the Metallica being a typical example, or Slayer. But like where Metallica was after having like amazing albums, and Slayer after doing probably their best albums in the 80s. The 90s probably would have seen like the Guns N' Roses were getting like overly bloated. Like you had Use Your Illusions were in the early 90s. I think that was the death knell for Guns N' Roses, and a lot of the metal, hair metal was just gone fucking out of control.
It was kind of odd because that was kind of the pinnacle of Guns N' Roses, but it was sort of the peak at which they were just about to topple over the edge kind of thing.
I think this is what happens with metal a lot of times. You see, once it starts getting popular, that's a death.
I was like, oh my god, they sold out, man.
Yeah, now a lot of people say that it's because the fans kind of turn on them when they get popular, as if there's this thing where people, it's when the music changed and it becomes more towards popular leans. It's like if you're into fucking someone like Cannibal Corpse, and if Cannibal Corpse did a ballad in the morning,
about My Little Pony,
it doesn't go. The people that are listening to Cannibal Corpse aren't going to like that. They're going to go, oh, this is not what I want to listen to. And even I think it happened with Metallica a bit. Metallica had their biggest selling album at the start of the 90s. I think it was 91 the Black Album was released. And they had Nothing Else Matters on it, which was a ballad, which was the kind of thing that they were always shitting on other bands doing with the hair metal bands, because it was just a formula at that point where it was like, right, release one song that's kind of like a little bit shitty, people have an idea of your name, then do the fucking ballad and you'll be massive, and then you can knock out whatever shit you want after that. And like Guaranteed Metallica were massive anyway at that stage. I think they're after proving themselves, but they wanted to do something different. I don't think they were setting out to make a massively successful commercial.
No, I don't think they were like, oh, let's do a pop album or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I mean, they had a kind of a couple of almost ballads before, like sort of the Fade to Black and, you know, sort of Sanitarium, those kind of a thing. But this is a proper like, let's do a love song. But it was,
and I don't think you can really fucking like, I mean, the whole thing is they're after doing 4 albums up to that point. And like that's not including Garage Day Revisited and a lot of the other stuff that they did, where it's I think one of the things I will always say about Metallica, like I'm not a massive fan of them anymore, but they have consistently done what they wanted to do with their career. And I think at that point they were like, right, let's try something different, let's do this. Like there's bizarrely, like, I mean, I think it's, looking back in hindsight, it's easy to kind of like, say with something like Enter Sandman, they did not think that Enter Sandman, they didn't fucking think that when they were writing that, alright, we're going to be playing this, we're going to have to play this every show.
This is going to close the show every time we play live. I know, they didn't expect that. Or Sad But True, right? Like the Sad But True is the big banger, and it's like, oh, yeah, everyone wants to hear this all the time.
It's just the production values, I think, were a bit better on it. The songs were shorter. Probably not as dark in content with some of the stuff, but for whatever reason, I think it was audience tastes were after changing as well, and people were a little bit more primed from the likes of Guns N' Roses and all that for a Metallica album. And that was massive. But I think that was also kind of like, you know, the nail in the coffin as well for metal to a certain degree, not because of what they did, but it was just around that time because people were after getting to the point where it was like, and I think people were just fed up with it. And like normal metal, kind of like people were kind of like, as much as they loved Metallica, they were kind of turning against it. So Metallica ended up becoming just like a massive popular band, which kind of went against all the trash kind of stuff with it.
Yeah, they're veering kind of away from trash more towards just like proper solid heavy rock kind of a thing, I suppose, really, rather than out now trash. Yeah,
Slayer, I think, were kind of like on a bit of a down kind of like point, kind of like Anthrax. Anthrax just seem to have been steady the whole
Anthrax are just Anthrax, weren't they? Yeah.
Megadeth, I think, were doing but Megadeth were kind of like, I think, adored by kind of like people that were into thrash music and stuff. Whereas Megadeth kind of, they never hit the scales of Metallica with it. Because I suppose they never really had that kind of catchy tune. Like entered like the massive, like great songs, but like, you know, not kind of like something that kind of like was going to be number one.
It's not going to top the charts, yeah.
Yeah. Actually saying we were looking at the whole thing with Dave Mustaine last night playing Symphony for Destruction, and he forgot
halfway through. Yeah, he's kind of, hang on, where does the riff go next? And you can see him kind of
smiling, kind of going, fuck,
how I managed to forget my own riff.
I've forgotten this. But I suppose with all those kind of things, what started happening was it was trash, and some of the early death metal stuff was after laying the foundations for and giving people a taste of extreme music. So I think when I kind of think of the early 90s and 90s metal, I always kind of think of Pantera.
Yeah, of course.
And I think Pantera really were the ones that laid the foundation for the 90s with a lot of stuff. And Sepultura. Sepultura kind of came out of their trash kind of thing, and they did Chaos AD, which I don't know how to describe Chaos AD. It's a trash metal, but there's kind of like there's hints of a new metal kind of thing going on. But it's kind of like black metal-y, kind of like death metal. There's just that extreme sound to it, yeah. And then when they added in the tribal kind of element to it as well, I think a lot of people probably heard it and were like, "Oh my god, the rhythm
heard this
section, with it." But Pantera definitely, like Pantera's first album, kind of like Cowboys from Hell. There is still some kind of, I suppose, metally, very metally kind of songs in it. Even Cowboys from Hell is very metal, even though it's heavy, but even the singing is a bit more high pitched. But you have stuff like Domination, Primal Concrete, Sledge, which is just, it reminds me of hardcore punk mixed, like groove to that, yeah. Then kind of like, you know, Dimebag Darrell, obviously everyone knows Dimebag was into like fucking Kiss and all that, like he was obsessed with Kiss, but it has that kind of like guitar work to it as well with the heaviness. It was just a mix match of everything. And it just worked. And I think one of my favourite lines when like Phil Anselmo was talking about Pantera is, yeah, we were sitting there and we were kind of thinking, hey, those bands, they save the money riff till the end. Why don't we make every riff the money?
And why not?
It was so people, and it is, you listen to, and it's genius.
Yeah.
And they continued with that kind of like for the most of their career. I suppose then kind of like with Pantera, instead of kind of like jumping around kind of like timelines, but like with Pantera, they with like a vulgar display of power, I think knocked everyone off their fucking feet. It was like, I remember the vulgar videos that they used to do with them on tour, and Phil Anselmo used to always go on a bit like, you know, being fucking punk rock and kind of like, you know, so I think there was that element to it. And this is, I think, the thing that kind of like really shaped the 90s, which I probably went off a tangent, is at the start, thrash was that mixture of punk and metal, and this is what kind of continued to happen with different things. And like Pantera, I think they were just a mixed match of everything, but it's just heavy music kind of came together, and particularly on that album. And I love their kind of like ballad on it was This Love, which is it's a violent, hilarious song.
It's not your typical ballad, really. Yeah.
I've ever seen him playing it at Donington on MTV Headbangers Ball in the 90s, and it was just fucking kind of like, he was pissed, like falling around, and it was just ad-libbing as well through it, like talking, and it was oh my god, these are, and seeing Sepultura and Biohazard and all. Actually, I think this is the thing that made metal so diverse in the 90s, was the mixture of MTV, because they had Headbangers Ball, people were starting to see all these extreme bands, or kind of like, you know, bands that you'd never even think of before kind of around. And I think that was how I got exposed to Pantera at first. Seeing one of their videos and going, oh my god. Probably for fucking Walk or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Pantera went on. And, like, we'll probably end up doing a thing about the history of Pantera at some point. There's no, because it's all over the place. But Phil Anselmo had a lot in the 90s as well, with like other bands when he, like Supergiant, Ritual, Down, which we've talked about before, and we're going on about No The Rock. Down, I think people underplay the importance of Down, I think, in the 90s as well.
As you sit there wearing your Down t-shirt.
Oh yeah, I forgot I'm wearing there. But it's what they did, like bringing that slow kind of draw. You know, they did something different, kind of, but something similar to the 70s, you know. I think they kind of brought, and there was a lot of that with like Pantera stuff as well, when you go into, and their cover version of Planet Caravan and Far Beyond Driven is fucking insane. But yeah, Pantera, I suppose that's kind of like Pantera probably brought in the kind of like,
they rang in the 90s as such, didn't they? Really. And then, as we were talking about, like the proper death of metal came along in the grunge days. And I'd argue, I think that grunge is actually metal. I think the majority of the bands it's
are fucking
another
metal
strand
bands,
of metal, I think. If you go away from sort of your typical sort of old indie kid kind of grunge, and if you look at the sort of the more unusual forms of grunge, like say Fate, the ones that kind of got lobbed into it, like Fate No More and Alice
Fate
in
No More
Chains
never
and
thrown
all the
into
rest.
the grunge
They
thing. That's,
were
we're talking
kind
about them
of-
alternative metal. That was another thing, because alternative rock and indie rock became a thing in the 90s. But like with grunge, like Nirvana were a punk band. Soundgarden are a metal band. Alice in Chains are a metal band.
Absolutely, yeah.
A lot of these big bands, they're fucking metal bands. It's just that they went away from...
They went a bit shoegazy, I think, rather than in some of the bands, rather than sort of, you know, hard rock. And
well, they went to Drop D Tune was the thing. There wasn't so much of an emphasis put on solos. They had the punk rock attitude, whereas you don't need to be like fucking all these fiddly Eddie Van Halen solos. It was going away from that. And yeah, it was singing about real things as opposed to what, like, metal, I think, rightly or wrongly, kind of got categorized as being singing about fucking dragons and demons and
Wizards
all these fantasy things, and it just became associated with that in a Spinal Tap kind of way. And then like hair metal, like the over excessiveness,
it was
and
like
all that.
women and cars and
And like a lot of them will turn around and say the bands that like heavily influenced, and I think heavily influenced the way metal went in the future, the Melvins. Which we'll cover in another episode of the show as well at some say. Melvin's massively influential on people, and you go back and listen to some of early Melvin stuff. It sounds a lot like early White Zombie stuff, I think, as well, but it's like chugging, drop D tune, fucking it's just, I can't say enough good things about them, but they influenced a lot of the bands that came that were defined as grunge after that. And even Mudhoney at the start of the grunge thing, when it started breaking out of Seattle, they were seen as the ones that were going to be big. No one saw Nirvana as being the ones that were going to get big. And then when they signed to Geffen and they released Nevermind, it just blew
exploded worldwide.
And what's really funny with Nirvana as well, like, Nevermind is probably their only commercial album. Would it? Because like you have, I think Insecticide releasing the other thing, like people heard that and they're like, what the fuck is this shit? And then even with kind of like In Utero, people were like, what the fuck? And it's like, this is Nirvana. Have you not listened to Bleach? And it's, for as popular as they were and as successful as they were, a lot of it was based around Nevermind and fucking when they did the Unplugged session.
The acoustics.
And I think a lot of people as well associate grunge with like Pearl Jam, Pearl Jam were always a rock band. They came from a glam rock background as well, with Mother Love Bone. And then when the singer died, they changed it up. But Alice in Chains, outright metal fucking band. I think they went on tour with Anthrax and a few of those other bands, kind of like opening up for them. And people were like hurling bottles at them and stuff. And it's like, you listen to Alice in Chains are a metal band. They're fucking in leather jackets as well. Look at, I can never remember his name. Yeah. He was like,
as metal as you get.
Same with Soundgarden. You can't listen to fucking like Rusty Cage or any of the stuff. It did, like later on when they went, I think beyond Super Unknown, they became more kind of hard rock. But I suppose the whole thing then with that was you had this thing that started coming up around it was what we call kind of like alternative metal, because you had this alternative rock scene going on with likes of Ween, my God, I can't think of the name. Sonic Youth were kind of thrown into it. Dinosaur Jr., all these bands. They could have easily been categorised as grunge bands as well.
Yeah.
But they weren't. And like Smashing Pumpkins